If I could then move on to a big part of your thesis is, your submission is about how the tech companies have to do more. That there's more that can be done and more that needs to be done by the technology companies. And you talk about the technology coalition from page 1, how they did not develop or deploy any effective solution. It took you a year to develop and deploy PhotoDNA, but it took a further 5 years before Google was willing to deploy this technology on their platform. But you then draw the distinction between the success that this approach has had for child pornography and child exploitation towards the absence of movement with respect to extremism. How the Counter-Extremism Project, along with government agencies, this is page 2 of your submission, how the Counter-Extremism Project, along with the government agencies around the world, have been calling on technology companies and social media in particular to rein in the ability of extremists to recruit, radicalize, plan, and execute attacks. But the response of the technology companies, largely denial and inaction, has been eerily similar to the call in early 2000 to combat online child exploitation. The technology companies are likely to strongly disagree with your statements. Some of the statements they've issued, this was Facebook making a statement in November 2017. 99% of the ISIS and Al-Qaeda related terror content we remove from Facebook is content we detect before anyone in our community has flagged it to us. And in some cases, before it goes live on the site. Once we are aware of a piece of terror content, we remove 83% of subsequently uploaded copies within 1 hour of upload. A further example of this denial or disagreement from them, this was Mr. Simon Milner's response here in this committee when we had quoted some of your representations to him. And he says, and I quote, "It is absolutely wrong and completely unfair for him to say that. We have provided evidence to you about what Facebook," he said us, "Facebook is doing on the issue of deliberate online falsehoods. If you would like us to provide information about all the work our companies have done over the last several years to combat terrorism and radicalization, we can do that and absolutely prove to you that his evidence is fundamentally wrong. He has a particular axe to grind about his form of technology, and he's absolutely wrong on this. If you look at what a number of different governments have said around the world, including the European Commission, about the work that we have done collectively to address this problem, you will find a very different answer. We are very happy to provide that, but I really want to be in no uncertain terms tell you that his evidence is wrong." And then in further quote, Google and YouTube, just to make sure this is a platform agnostic process, in December 2017 saying 98% of videos we remove for violent extremism are flagged by our machine learning algorithms, and that 70% is removed within 8 hours of being uploaded. So I would ask you 3 questions, Professor Farid. Firstly, am I right to understand that moving on from child exploitation, child pornography, with respect to issues of around extremism and terrorism, all the platforms claim and may have evidence to support this, that they have been able to then prevent material from being uploaded, as well as take down material which has been identified as being inappropriate? And I use the word inappropriate. These are not necessarily material that someone has declared as being illegal, which is a distinctly different approach from what you've talked about for child pornography. That their approach is once inappropriate content has been flagged, they have both the ability and the will to prevent an upload as well as taking down material. That's my first question. To what extent is this capability there? My second question, if I'll just scope out my questions and then you can choose how to answer it. My second question is, what is your response to their characterization of your comments, so their denial or their disagreement with your position and the various quotes that I've read out, and we can refresh your memory if necessary. And thirdly, why do you think there is this either discordance between what is possible and what they're actually doing, the discordance between what you are stating as the reality of today and what they are saying is actually what they're doing? So 3 different questions. The extent to which this is being developed and dealt with for extremism and terrorism, your comments on what they have said about your position, and why you feel there is this discordance.
Okay, good. So let's talk about a few things. So first of all, the technology companies have been being asked for years to take down counter-extremism, terrorism-related material, starting back in 2013, 2014. And effectively, nothing got done until late 2017. And that happened in response to incredible pressure from the EU and growing pressure from Capitol Hill here in the US. So I reject this notion that the technology companies have been proactive, have always been eager to have this fight. They drag their feet with the extremism-related material in the same way that they drag their feet in the child exploitation. So there's a little revisionist history happening here. And let me be clear, I don't have an axe to grind. This has never been a business issue, never been a financial issue. This has always been about my belief that the technology companies are not doing as good of a job as I would like them to do, and that I think that they need to do. So nobody can deny, despite claims now that they were always supportive of the child pornography, is that they dragged their feet, in some cases for a decade, to do anything. So that has been a pattern of behavior that we have seen over and over again, not just in the beginning of the internet, but even until fairly recently. So I should preface this by saying, I don't know, because the companies won't reveal to us what the technology is that they're using. We hear statistics from them, but we actually don't have a lot of transparency. We don't have a lot of ways of understanding how much material is coming in and how much material is being really eliminated. I'm not sure I understand how the technology company can say they eliminate 98% of the material without knowing what the denominator is in that ratio. How do they know what they're missing? So I'll get back to that in a little bit. Okay, so in terms of, do they have the capability to do this? I believe that they do for the following reason. For many years, for far longer than we've been dealing with the child exploitation and the counter-extremism, the technology companies have had technology to find and remove copyright infringement materials. And the reason they have that is because they were getting sued and they had a financial interest in developing and deploying that technology. So I genuinely believe that they have the ability to do this, okay? There has not been a lot of, in fact, there's been no transparency. So they claim now, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter claim to be using a similar type of technology to photo DNA to find and remove extremist material. We do not know, however, how large the database is, how much material is in there, how aggressively is it grown, how much material do they find, how quickly does it get removed. We don't know this. Now, I will say, I can't say anything about Facebook, but let me say a few things about YouTube. So we have been using our robust hashing technology to try to determine how often extremist material gets uploaded to YouTube and how long it stays on that platform. And I will tell you that I dispute this idea that I think you said 98% of the material is removed. We are seeing material stay online for hours, days, and in some cases weeks, garnering thousands and tens of thousands of views. And some of it comes down maybe after 48 hours. Some of it stays on weeks later. So at least from our view of what we are seeing being uploaded to YouTube, we're able to find material that YouTube doesn't seem to be able to find. It is absolutely incorrect to say that they are finding this at upload. This content, the same videos are being uploaded over and over again, and they are staying live for hours, days, and in some cases weeks. So I don't believe that story. With respect to the technology companies, you have to look at the pattern of behavior over the last 2 decades. We have seen a pattern of behavior starting back in the early 2000s to today. Look, you can't open a newspaper without reading about the issues with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, of how the social medias have been less than forthcoming and how they have been dealing with these issues. So you will excuse me if I am less than simply trustworthy that as they cite statistics, we should simply say, okay, everything is solved, we should all go away. The fact is this material is still being pushed online. The fact is we can still find this material, at least on YouTube. I can't speak for Facebook because we can't examine the private faces of Facebook the way we can with YouTube. But I can tell you, we are finding this material on YouTube on a daily basis. And I think there was a third question about the disconnect between the technologies, yeah?
Okay. Between the viewpoints.
So, between the viewpoints, right. So, again, you know, I think given the pattern of behavior of the social media companies and the less than aggressiveness on dealing with these issues, I think it is reasonable to ask for more transparency and more details on exactly what they are doing, how this technology has been deployed, what is the technology? We still have not actually gotten a very clear answer to that. How aggressive is the database that they are looking for? How aggressively does it grow? Who contributes to it? It's supposed to be a shared database, but is it actually shared? I will tell you from talking to insiders at these companies, I think it is not the picture that is being painted to your committee.
Thank you very much, Professor. So this, in a way, is well highlighted in the statement that the Counter-Extremism Project put out on January 17th. And if I might just quote some passages from that, I presume you stand by it. It says, it is time for regulators to promulgate measures to force the industry to take necessary action to protect the public. But earlier on, leading up to that, CEP remains concerned about the level of commitment, consistency, and transparency that will be required to overcome the systematic misuse of these platforms. While big social media platforms acknowledge the existence of radicalizing content that violates their stated terms of service, their response to date has followed a familiar pattern utilized in response to other discoveries of abuse: denial, followed by half measures and attempts to spin the issue in the media, and finally reluctant action when faced with threats to their bottom line or possible regulatory action. And several paragraphs which I think are very similar to the statements that you've made. And then one action does not constitute a lasting solution. Industry-wide standards are needed to ensure the timely and permanent removal of dangerous content. Lawmakers and the public should demand that tech finally implement industry-wide standards and policies that ensure the timely and permanent removal of dangerous, extremist, and terrorist material, establish measurable best practices, and transparently deploy proven technologies to prevent the re-upload of materials already determined to violate company policies. And then the statement that I began with. So if I might synthesize what we've talked about today, Professor, you're explaining that the technology and the processes exist to be able to identify and define a particular type of imagery, whether still or video, that having done so, you can robustly detect the uploads of such video or where such images are already online, that this has been very successfully done for child pornography and child exploitation. The social media platforms claim that they have had some significant success with extremism, but you believe they can do a lot more and that perhaps their success is limited in this space. And some of this is demonstrated by their ability to very successfully go after copyrighted material as it affects their business model and their financial incentives. So so the lack of impact or the lack of effectiveness is perhaps a decision around policy or design or business model rather than a technical impediment. And in this process,
I completely...
Please?
I completely agree with everything you've said so far.
And in this process, we have a long track record of material which has been identified through due process to be illegal and therefore acted upon, inappropriate but not necessarily illegal and therefore acted upon, other material which has been determined to be illegal or inappropriate but not acted upon. And that decision to act or not act is at the behest of the social media companies.
Yes.
And that ultimately this solution will require a combination of a regulatory approach, a humanistic approach in terms of the determining what is appropriate or what is illegal, and a technological solution in order to ensure that the effect is at scale and fast enough, and that the technology today is not an impediment to this process that I have described.
I completely agree with everything you said. And I'll, if I may just add one more thing. When we developed PhotoDNA in 2008, 2009, it was very clear that this was supposed to be the start of more development of technology. And I will say that from 2008, when we first developed it, deployed it in 2009 and on, to 2017, there was no more development of any types of technologies. So imagine the 3, 4, 5 largest technologies in the world, worth collectively trillions of dollars, deciding we don't need to innovate anymore for 5, 6, 7 years. I reject this idea that they are aggressively going after this content. It's simply, the data simply doesn't support that. The actions simply don't support it. I think that I think as the statement said, is that they put in just enough to stave off the regulatory issues, but not enough to really go after it. And I think a lot of it comes back down to the issue that we were talking about earlier with platform versus publisher. As soon as they get in the business of moderating the content, they start to risk looking like a publisher, and that has serious liability issues for them.
Thank you very much, Professor Farid, for your submission as well as talking to us this morning. Mr. Chairman, please.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? This one? Yeah.
Professor, can I just, I'm Desmond on the panel, can I just ask one question? Many representatives who wrote in to the Select Committee described how important it is to put in efforts on the front of media literacy to get users of social media sites, of search engines, to be able to discern whether what they're reading is true or false, whether it's hate speech, whether it is content that is illegal. Based on your research or your understanding of this space, to what extent can media literacy assist in addressing the spread of deliberate online falsehoods?
So let me say I'm not an expert on media literacy. I'm not an expert in social science. However, having said that, I do believe that the solution to the proliferation of fake news has a multidimensional approach. We've been talking a lot about the responsibility of the social media. We've been talking a lot about technology that can be deployed, but we absolutely have to talk about how we as consumers digest digital media. We have to change our viewing habits. Again, I'm not an expert on that. My intuition and my belief is that has to play a fairly fundamental role, because at the end of the day, we are the ones reading, we are the ones sharing, and we are the ones promoting this. So I think we can't ignore that part. We have to consider all aspects that we've been talking about.
Can I just take it one step further, Professor? The social media companies have, in testimony in the UK and the US and here in Singapore, both written and oral, articulated the importance of the users of their sites being discerning. So media literacy efforts, they're investing in it, they're working with stakeholders on it. And you spoke earlier, and I was listening to your testimony, about your sense that, and it's your conjecture, because you can't see inside the black box, that social media companies are, having provided a site that is free to use by members of the public, would, in your conjecture, drive the algorithm towards greater engagement, because the business model is one based on advertising, and you say that's not surprising. And you also said, correct me if I'm wrong, that that the algorithm is because it is is designed by humans. It's the parameters are driven by the publishers or the developers of the algorithm. That it is not possible to say that the sites are entirely passive platforms, but in a way they design the algorithm with some commercial objectives to drive the content that users see. How would you, please comment on this, because I'm trying to reconcile the both. On the one hand, they're saying that the users of the site should be careful what they read. On the other hand, they are setting up algorithms that drive content towards these users in a way that is aligned with the interests of advertisers.
Yeah, so this really strikes at the core of the issue, right? So this strikes at the core of the underlying business model of much of the internet today, which is advertising. It's collecting our personal data, whether that is legal or illegal, as we've seen, and then driving advertising to us and keeping us on the platform to keep driving that advertising. At the end of the day, this is a really deep, fundamental, I would argue, existential issue of what we want our internet to be. How do we want access to information? Do we want the Wikipedia model, or do we want the YouTube model? It's one way to think about it, right? And those two platforms are fascinating. On the one hand, you have Wikipedia, right, which is not perfect, but it is not for profit, purely voluntary, no advertising whatsoever, and does a fairly good job of keeping their platform clean and honest and trustworthy. On the other hand, you have this multi-$100 billion company, right, which is driven entirely or mostly by advertising dollars, which has a serious fake news, conspiracy, extremism, child pornography, et cetera, problem. So one could argue that the core business model is at fault here. I'm not saying that we should be in the business of disrupting the entire business model, but I'm saying that we should not be surprised that when you give away the product for free, what I always tell my students is that if you're not paying for the product, you are the product, okay? So we are become the product, right? And I don't think we should be surprised. Here's my hope, because I don't know how to change that fundamental underlying business model. So here's my hope. My hope is that companies will emerge that will offer products to people like me, people like you, people who don't want to be the target of this type of invasion of privacy, and that we will change the underlying business models in a way that will lead to healthier online communities. Whether that will happen or not, I don't know. But my hope is that as we are seeing pressure build over the last few years on business as usual social media, I think we are going to start to see changes. I think this is something that governments can start to encourage the development of more honest, more safe, and more private and more secure infrastructures for our online world. This is a terrific role that governments can play.
Can I just ask a final question, Professor? And that's in relation to my colleague's earlier question, his second question to you, a second last question about your strong characterization of the, in your view, the social media companies' intransigence, the dragging of their feet over the last, say, 8 years or a decade or longer. It's both in your report as well as what you just said in the last hour or so, that you've characterized the social media companies as doing just about enough to stave off the threat of regulatory intervention, but not doing enough in respect of deliberate online falsehoods as they've done for violent extremism, radicalization, as well as child pornography. And in turn, when put to them, they have made very strong characterizations of your motivations and have articulated a totally different description of the actions over the last decade or so, and that they've been forthcoming and they've been very proactive, they've been leading at the forefront. It's very important for our select committee because the social media companies we view them as partners. We need to work with them on our national security and our social cohesion. They are partners in media literacy, and we need to understand and discern to what extent we can rely on their submissions, that they will continue to put in a lot of effort and be proactive in finding technological solutions on their part to help tackle this scourge of deliberate online falsehoods. They have indicated that they are prepared to and will put in submissions that tell us their version of history. And can I just ask, Professor, if asked by the committee, would you be prepared to do likewise so that we have two sets of histories for us to make a decision on?
Of course, I'd be happy to. And let me just say a few things. I think it's fair to question people's motivations, right? So why am I so critical of social media companies? Okay. So let me emphasize again, this is not a financial issue. This is not a business issue. This is not an ego issue. I don't care whose technology uses what, right? I am a technologist. I am an academic. And at the end of the day, I am looking at the landscape of where we've been, where we are, and where we are going, and I'm seeing serious issues. I am not the only one. Here in the US, we have had 4 congressional hearings in the last 8 months, one after the other, because every time these social media companies come to Capitol Hill and they testify, there is a sense that there is not a sufficient answer. There was a hearing at the UK just 2 weeks ago on issues of counterterrorism, where the special committee of the UK Parliament was questioning Google's executives on their inaction. You should look at that interview. It's really telling on some really glaring failures, despite the promise over and over again to do more, to do more. So I am very critical. I genuinely believe I don't have an ulterior motive. I'm trying to look at these things and facts as objectively as possible. I agree with you that this is best done in a non-adversarial fashion, that this is best done as a partnership. My concern is that the history has not been one of openness and honesty. So that doesn't mean the future has to be a lack of openness and honesty as well. But I think it requires some amount of due diligence on your part to make sure that it's not just the promise that things are being done, but that you can show quantitatively and critically and analytically that these actions are being done. We continue to see some failings despite what we are being told are technologies in place. So I'm unconvinced that things are working as well. You should go talk to your counterparts in the UK. They have grave concerns about the failures of social media companies to regulate known domestic terror groups within the UK. One of the MPs that was questioning the Google exec or the YouTube exec showed her iPad. That morning, she brought up her YouTube, and it said recommended videos were known terrorists, despite the promise that those things would not be promoted anymore. So, it still continues to be a disconnect between what we are being told and what we are seeing with our own eyes. And so I'm not convinced that we are where we need to be. Now, I will say that in the defense of the social media companies, that there has been action over the last years. I think the last year they have done better. I think it has been largely because of pressure from organizations such as yours, the EU, Capitol Hill, but that doesn't matter, right? It's okay. They're running a business. We are trying to run a society, and they will clash at times. That is fine. So I do think that there's been movement. I will say that I think the movement has been asymmetric. I think the Facebooks have been more responsive than the YouTubes and the Twitters. I think the Microsofts have been more responsive. So I think we shouldn't bundle up all the technology companies to one. I think that they are doing things with different levels of sense of urgency. And I would place Microsoft at sort of one end where they have been very aggressive and I think very good partners. And I think YouTube has been less responsive with respect to that company.